Now, I want to take the same logic that we made in the previous video and apply that to the other acceleration graphics. Let's first create a variable to hold this interpolation value so that we can decouple our logic as we did in lesson 8. So let's go to the variable tab and add a new variable, which we'll call effects underscore base underscore rotation, which will also be a float. And then drag it to the graph to create a setter. And let's control and click these connections to move them to the new node. Then create our onChange event, which we will need 3 of, so let's select the node and press Ctrl and D twice to duplicate it. Now if we drag this logic over here and think about how we will approach this, you can see that all 3 of these nodes will need to be repeated because the second input of the multiply node is going to be different for each sprite. And the conversion node and set rotation node will also have to be duplicated. Like I discussed in a previous video, you should always try and find a way to not repeat logic. If we look at our logic, we will see that the things that will be different for each graphic is the object ID and input 2 of the multiply node. So what we can do then is create what's called a function, which basically allows us to package up a set of self-contained logic with its own user-defined inputs and outputs, which can then be reused across your entire project as a custom node. So if you go over to this tab here with the FX icon, you can create a function in the same way that you create a variable. So let's click the plus icon and let's call this rotate underscore effects. So before we go into this function, let's select these nodes here and press Ctrl and C to copy them. Then double click on the function to open its own logic graph. And then press Ctrl and V to paste the nodes into the function. You'll see here that there are 2 nodes which we didn't paste in, which are called function input and function output. If we click on the function input node and look at its attributes, we can use the plus icon here to add sockets to our custom node. If we go back to the scene graph and first delete these nodes, and then drag the function to the main logic, you can see that those inputs are now added to the node. You can then double click on the node to go back to its logic graph, where we can modify these input sockets to fit with our needs. So the first input will be the amount that the rotation should be multiplied by. So let's call this multiplier and change its type to float. And the second input is the object ID, which we will call object ID and change the type to be object ID as well. So now let's connect the function input pulse to the multiply node and the multiplier to its input 2 socket. And the object ID to the object ID socket of the set rotation node. Let's also create a getter for our effects base rotation variable. And then plug that into the input 1 socket of the multiply node. And finally, let's plug the output pulse of the set rotation node into the function output node. Now if we go back to the scene graph, we can duplicate this function twice and link up the pulses and object IDs. And then for the multiplier inputs, let's add a simple node called numerical value. And this is basically an alternative to creating a variable, and is more useful when you only want to access the value in a single place. So let's duplicate this a couple of times and set their default value attributes to 1, 2, and 3. And of course, let's link up these to the multiplier sockets. Now when we press play, we can see the subtle effect in the background of our speed meter created by all these graphics rotating at different speeds. In the next video, we will be looking at ways of visually organizing our logic by using groups and the new reroute node.